Hello, everybody. Welcome to another English language episode of Futucast. My name is Yascha Mounk, and pleasure to be here with you. As you can see from the title, today we're talking about the World Happiness Report. This is, in some ways, quite personal for me even, since I'm Finnish, and we are 8 years in a row now designated, named, crowned the happiest country in the world. But in this episode, we're going to take a bit of a more critical look into this proposition. What is behind the World Happiness Report? What determines the most happy country in the world? As guests in this episode, we have, first of all, Yascha Mounk, who's a German-American political scientist and author. He's an associate professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University, School of Advanced International Studies. That's in Washington, D.C., I think, in the U.S.
That's correct. Not the most happy place, especially nowadays.
Not the most happy place, no. And you published a text on this year's publishing of the World Happiness Report called "The World Happiness Report is a Sham." That was actually the inspiration for this episode. It was a very interesting text, very thought-provoking, and something that I'm not used to hearing as a Finn, I must say. So it's very thought-provoking. So thanks for being here in the studio, or, I mean, in your New York apartment, but in our show. Thank you. And then as the other party in this interview, we're hosting Frank Martela. Also, you've been on Futucast actually before. That was years back. It was very fun to have you. It's fun to have you here again. Frank is a Finnish philosopher and a researcher for psychology, specializing in the question of meaning of life. He's an assistant professor at Aalto University here in Helsinki. And Frank, you've become more or less the de facto happiness intellectual here in Finland, I would say. Whenever there's a domestic or international media who does a piece about Finland winning the happiness, or Finnish happiness, or Nordic happiness, you're the guy they interview, it seems like. So also very happy to have you here on the show.
Yeah, happy to be here.
And this is more or less going to be a discussion. I have not set this up as a debate, but I can imagine, based on the title of your Substack and Frank, your comments on the happiness report before and Finnish happiness, there's maybe some fertile ground for some constructive disagreement here. Let's see. Let's start out with just a very basic, setting the table kind of question. Yascha, what spurred you to write this text, and why do you think the World Happiness Report is a sham?
Well, first of all, I mean, as somebody who's also trained in philosophy, nothing makes me happier than to disagree with people in an intelligent way. So I hope we're going to get deep into our disagreements if we do indeed have them. So I've always been a little bit skeptical of the World Happiness Report and some of its findings. I don't know Finland very well, I have to admit, but I do have family in both Sweden and Denmark. And of course, it's all the Scandinavian countries that tend to do very, very well on the happiness report. And for there's wonderful things about Scandinavia, and I can see how in many ways they are some of the best run societies in the world, places where people have a lot of opportunity and a lot of social protection. They don't always strike me as the happiest places. You walk through the city centers of some of these towns and you don't always see people in ecstasy, smiling and laughing and playing with each other, particularly during the relatively long winters. But I was really spurred on by looking a little bit more closely into the methodology of a World Happiness Report and recognizing that it really doesn't do anything like measuring happiness. Right. So there's a longer report where people look into all kinds of questions, come up with some interesting data. But the thing that captures the attention of the media each time is the ranking of countries. And that is based on one specific question, which isn't about happiness at all, but about life satisfaction. It's the so-called Cantrell's ladder, which says, imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. Suppose we say that the top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life. If the top step is 10 and the bottom step is 0, on which step of the ladder do you feel you personally stand at the present time? That's the exact wording of the question. Now, this asks you about the best possible life. So it asks about life satisfaction. Right? It asks about how is your life going on the whole. And that, I think, is quite a different question than happiness. We know, for example, from the research that people who have children have more satisfaction in their life, when you're 60, 70, 80 years old, having had children is an important determinant of feeling like your life had meaning. It doesn't mean that you're happier moment to moment when you spend time with your kids, especially when they're young kids that might be screaming in your ear. It turns out you call people up and you say, how are you feeling right now? And they're around their kids. A lot of the time they say, I'm really not very happy. And in fact, when you look at whether the ranking a country has on this Cantrell ladder, on this World Happiness Report, correlates with other kinds of things that we might think happiness consists in, the correlation basically doesn't exist. So are the happiest people in the world likely to smile more than others? Are they likely to say that they really enjoyed themselves yesterday? Are they likely to have these forms of positive affect? No, not at all. Are they at least likely to have an absence of negative affect? Are they less likely than other people to be depressed, to commit suicide, to worry a lot, to have all of these negative emotions? Not at all. And so it seems to me that a world happiness ranking in which the happiest people in the world aren't more likely to experience positive emotions than others, and aren't even less likely to be depressed, to commit suicide, to have some of these really horrible negative outcomes than others. That's not really a world happiness report at all. It's really misleading in what it measures.
Before I get to you, Frank, what do you think it measures then? You said it measures life satisfaction. And in fact, on the World Happiness Report website, they're not very shy about actually using this, and they actually defend using the Cantrell ladder with the following arguments. This question is both democratic and universal, they say, about the Cantrell ladder. Rather than constructing an index for multiple metrics, the Cantrell ladder empowers people to make their own judgments about what matters most, regardless of their culture and background.
Yeah, so I think if a report was called the World Self-Reported Life Satisfaction Report, it would get closer to what it is than the name World Happiness Report. I can also tell you that the New York Times would not every year write a story about the World Self-Reported Life Satisfaction Report because it sounds much less sexy and much less interesting, frankly. We also know that there's specific problems with this particular question. So there's some interesting research in which psychologists asked people to read this question, to rate themselves on this question, and to ask them what they associate with it, how they would describe how they answer this question. And it turns out that because of the metaphor of a ladder, of a top and the bottom, what they're really saying is, do I feel like I'm towards the top of a society? Do I feel like I'm towards the bottom of a society? So it actually gets at a much more materialistic and hierarchical view of the world than might be obvious. And then the last point is that there's obviously big cultural variations. Again, I'm loath to pretend to be an expert in Finnish culture, or even Scandinavian culture, speaking to two Finns and speaking to an audience of mostly Finnish and Scandinavian people. But I do think that there's a culture in Scandinavia of wanting to be satisfied, of feeling that it is unseemly to be dissatisfied with what you have in life. Of feeling that perhaps individual ambition beyond, broadly accepted metrics of social success and of having a decently thriving life may in some ways be unseemly. And so perhaps part of what is indicated by the very strong performance of Scandinavia on the Cantrell ladder is not that these are the most satisfied countries in the world. Though certainly people in Finland and Sweden, Denmark have good reason to be satisfied with their lives compared to many other countries in the world. I don't want to dispute that. It is in part that there is a broader culture of saying, you haven't achieved everything you wanted in your life. You're not the best looking guy in your friend circle. You don't have the best job in the world, but your life is going pretty well. You should be satisfied with that. Whereas in another culture, perhaps in the United States, the message is, you haven't quite achieved everything you want. There's some things that you still want in your life. Own up to being unsatisfied, to having great ambition, to wanting to do more. And so you might give a different answer to that question, even if some of the things you can be satisfied with and some of the things you're not fully satisfied with may be more similar than that answer indicates.
Great. Okay, Frank, I want to give you the same question, but also if you want to start to directly respond to anything that Yascha said, you're very welcome to. But the same question to you. What do you think about the World Happiness Report?
Yeah, so overall, I agree with the fact that think that they're measuring is more that this general life satisfaction or general life evaluation. So that's kind of like a key factor. But at the same time, when we think about how to then like measure happiness as such, I guess like in the psychological literature, there's also often this discussion that there's like this both this affective and evaluative dimension to it. And quite often, like for example, in psychological studies, we measure we measure like subjective well-being by having like questions about positive and negative affect, and then having questions about life satisfaction, and then like more combining them into an index. So in this sense, the kind of like the World Happiness Report is focusing only on this cognitive aspect, that when you stop and think about your life, how satisfied are you with it? How close do you find it to be the best possible or the worst possible life? So I agree that, that if there would be like index of positive feelings, like if you ask people like, whether you feel like joyfulness today, whether you smile or laugh today, in these kind of indexes, the kind of ranking of the countries would be a bit different. I think Finland would be like, if I remember correctly, something like the 40th in the world. So like quite far from the top of the world. So I guess like that's where kind of like this impression comes, that when people come to the Scandinavian countries, they don't see like so many smiling faces, and might think that this doesn't look like a too happy country from that point of view. So I tend to say that kind of the Nordic countries, or Finland especially, is kind of like this land of quiet satisfaction. So we are like, quietly satisfied with their life. We might not be like too much smiling, or like, be too like extroverted, or like extroverted about it, or like, announcing it to the world. But then when we stop and think about our life, we tend to be like relatively satisfied with that. So yes, so when we think about like what we are measuring, it's like, I agree that, the more accurate name for this World Happiness Report will be World Life Evaluation Report or something like that. But I also agree that if it would the name would be that, then it wouldn't have like the same media attention that it has right now. So I guess like it's a conscious choice from the makers of the survey to call it Happiness Report, because that's makes it much more interesting for the reader.
Do you think it's misleading, Frank?
So I guess I would say like, I guess like it's like inaccurate in the sense that, that we have to specify what is like the thing that there's measuring. But like, I wouldn't say that there's like, there's one question that would be like the best possible measure of happiness, because it's kind of like a debate that whether we should, some people say that, happiness is more about, just fleeting feelings, the joyfulness and sadness and so forth. And then some other people say that no, when we think about happiness, we should have like this more overall view of a person's life rather than just these fleeting everyday feelings. So I guess like there will be like arguments on both sides, which of them is like the true happiness. And I'm kind of like saying that rather than like focus, I guess like quite many psychologists, when they actually write their research studies, they quite rarely use the word happiness, because like then when they talk about the measures, then they talk about life satisfaction or positive affect or negative affect or whatever specific things they're measuring. So there's like several psychologist papers also where, the only place where the word happiness is found is on the title of the paper. So the title is about happiness, but then the abstract, the whole paper itself is about life satisfaction or positive affect, whichever they're like measuring in the paper.
Interesting. You must have started out with some kind of assumption of what happiness means, Yascha, when you made this observation and wanted to write a piece sort of criticizing the World Happiness Report for using this word happiness. Because, as you said, there seems to be an agreement here that the Cantrell ladder measures something. It measures life satisfaction, and that's not nothing. And it's not completely different from what happiness could mean in some contexts. But you still think that it's different enough so that the use of the word happiness is misleading. Do I have you correct there?
Yeah, I think so. I think actually it doesn't sound like Frank and I are that far apart in our assessment of this. I certainly think that life satisfaction, that kind of more reflective attitude about our life, is one part of what can plausibly be meant by happiness. I also certainly think that that more effective dimension is also important, right? If somebody is 80 years old and they have led a very dutiful life, and perhaps they have a real accomplishment to look back on, perhaps in the professional realm, perhaps they've raised a family in a dutiful way, but they've never enjoyed themselves, right? They've never for a moment allowed themselves to actually be in the moment and have that feeling of what I would intuitively call happiness. I think that's significant that they take the satisfaction of life, that they've accomplished something in their lives. I don't think that isn't a part of happiness at all. But to say that person has led a deeply happy life would, I think, be quite misleading. It would be one-dimensional. Perhaps in one dimension they did, but on these other very important dimensions they did not. And so to me, I don't have an issue with using the Cantor ladder, of using this life satisfaction score as one of the dimensions of happiness. But I think it is very intuitive that we should also use those other ones. But if you never smile, if you never take joy, if you never spend time with your friends, if you're never in the moment, then you're not truly happy, right? If you're satisfied with your life at one level, but also you're deeply depressed and you have suicidal ideations, quite strange to say you're deeply happy. And so that's why I do think that indices that look at all of these subdimensions, right, that try and not just look at one of them are more convincing. And that's why, to me, it's important that when two distinguished economists, Danny Blanchflower and Alex Bryson, did that for one of the reports, and they come up with a completely different ranking, that undermines my confidence in the World Happiness Report. You should think that if this one question really captures happiness in a deep way, then it should at least be correlated strongly with those other kind of dimensions. And if it's not, then we have a very different finding, which is interesting, which is that Scandinavian countries really excel at giving people that life satisfaction, whether that's because they, have a strong welfare state and have a dynamic economy and are highly educated and do well in the Human Development Index and so on, or because of cultural reasons that make people more easily satisfied, perhaps a mix of both, right? But then there's other countries that excel at giving people these experiences of joy or protecting them against feelings of loneliness and isolation and so on. And those are other dimensions that are really important. I think, looking at all of those dimensions ends up telling us a lot more about the world. Because what I worry about, especially in those press reports, is that people read, people in Scandinavia, they're deliriously happy. If I want to go somewhere where I'm just going to have fun every day, I should move to Uppsala. And much as I like Uppsala, I'm not sure that that is the right message we should be sending people.
Yeah, Uppsala in November. Fun every day is not the thing that comes to mind. But I can completely agree with you that in an optimal way, optimal situation, we would have these several measures that we are looking and hopefully look them at separately, because we know more about the person's situation, we know more about the nation's situation when we look at both the life satisfaction of the people and then look at the positive affect of the people and a bunch of other things. So there's several psychological things, and of course the positive things tend to correlate with each other. So people who are high life satisfaction tend to have higher levels of positive affect, but the correlations are not too high. So there's quite much variation within a person. So one person might be high on life satisfaction, but not so high on positive feelings. Might actually have even some negative feelings quite much. So all of these combinations are possible, and when we have these several questions, then we can get these more interesting findings. And actually, that with this August Nielsen that you mentioned, we actually had one study where we were actually looking at this, what kind of rankings we get when we look at positive feelings or negative feelings, and they indeed are quite different from this thing. But I guess still quite many psychologists would argue that that okay, because of course it's always a question of space, how much space you have for different questions. So ideally, you would ask several questions from people. But then, for example, OECD, they said that if there's room for 4 questions, then one life satisfaction question, one positive affect, one negative affect, and then one question more about this this meaningfulness is life, or how much significance you find in your activities. They have this one recommendation about these 4 questions being the ones if you have space. But I think that they still argue that if you only have space for one question, then this life satisfaction is still the best question. Because life satisfaction tend to be more correlated with various life events and various factors that we would think that that happiness is correlated with. So if you get divorced, your life satisfaction goes down. If you get unemployment, then your life satisfaction goes down. If you win a lottery, your life satisfaction goes up, and so forth. So it seems to be reacting to life events in a way that one would think that it would be reacting life events. And also then on the national level, there has been studies that trying to then predict why some nations have higher life satisfaction than others in these rankings. And then of course GDP per capita is one predictor. So more richer nations on average tend to be more satisfied with their lives. But then there's quite many other factors, which, for example, explain why the Nordic countries are performing better than many other European countries or the United States, even though they're from the pure GDP per capita point of view, Finland shouldn't be like not in the top 10 or like, because there's quite many countries which are much richer from that point of view. And these factors are, for example, like the quality of the democratic institutions, lack of corruption, free election, free press, and these kind of things. They have been shown to predict life satisfaction. Another factor is these welfare benefits that those countries, which tend to have like relatively good welfare benefits, unemployment benefits, and maternity leaves, paternity leaves, and so these kind of things, and relatively regulated like work life, those countries also tend to be like performing better than one would predict just based on the GDP per capita. And then trust in institutions and trust in other people is another factor that has been like shown to predict higher life satisfactions. And in all of these indexes, then like the Nordic countries tend to be like performing very well. So the Nordic countries tend to be the countries where people trust each other, trust each institutions the most. A couple of years ago, I think Finland was number one in trust in police kind of questions. So in no other country, people trusted the police more than in Finland. And also as regards lack of corruption, the Nordic countries are in the top of the world as regards like lack of corruption. So also these political structures that tend to be like predicting higher life satisfaction tend to be ones where the Nordic countries are performing very well. And many other countries in the kind of like top 10, which are not the Nordic countries, Netherlands or Luxembourg, Australia, they also have like similar predictors, that similar things that I think that they have relatively well-functioning institutions, also relatively well-functioning democracy. And so these kind of factors might explain why they also are like performing so well. So it's like kind of like, in a way, I think that it's not only the Nordic countries, but it's like, any country which has like these relatively well-functioning institutions.
Right. So you would say that it's not just the subjective trust in itself, it's the ability to trust that is important here.
I guess like there's like this feedback between like, of course, when you have like lack of corruption, like where the corruption levels are like objectively on low levels, then people tend to trust the institutions. And so it's kind of like, and when they trust the institutions, then they're also like, willing to vote for parties which are preserving the institutions. So this Bo Rothstein, who is this Swedish political scientist, he said that, the Nordic countries have like this kind of like high trust equilibrium in a way, that, because we trust the institutions, then people in the institutions behave in a trustworthy way, which then like, retains the trust in institutions and makes people wanting to vote for parties which are kind of like wanted to preserve the institutions. I remember I think that was it Jeffrey Sachs or some US economist, he said that, that the Nordic countries are basically the only countries where you can go to the elections and say, we're going to raise the taxes and, we'll win on that platform. Because in many other countries, people don't trust the government so much, so they don't want to have more taxes because they're not sure where the money will go. But in the Nordic countries, people still trust that the money will go mostly to good use for themselves, for their own healthcare and education and so forth, or for the other people. So they are willing to pay even quite high taxes, because that's actually one thing that where Finnish people are also when there's some surveys about how willing you are to pay the taxes, the Finnish people tend to be also on the top of the world as regards willingness to pay taxes.
Is this the end of history then, Yascha? Do we have a scientific formula for good politics?
No, I don't think so. If we had a scientific formula for good politics, we'd have fixed a lot of things. And just to go back to the question of trust, I think if you have good reason to trust the institutions, it probably is good for you to trust them. If you're in a context where the institutions aren't trustworthy, trusting them probably is a recipe for disaster. So I agree with Frank that this is a kind of a question of equilibria. I think what is interesting, though, is that what message do we want to send people? Not just about whether Finland is up and the Netherlands is somewhere in the middle and Japan is down or whatever, but about how to think about happiness in our individual cases. And I think what's interesting is just the ways in which dimensions of happiness and life satisfaction come apart to an extent that I think is quite surprising. Right. So I mentioned one earlier, which really struck me in the research, and Frank knows the research better than I do, so you can jump in and correct me if I'm misrepresenting something. But from what I understand, if you ask people, do you have meaning in your life? Then things like having children is really predictive of having meaning in your life. When you ask people, when do you think you're happiest, moment to moment? When do you enjoy yourself most? People who are parents say, when I'm with my kids. And when you ask them, when do you think you're going to be happiest, at least happy? They say, when I'm at work. When you ring them up and you say, what are you doing right now? And how are you enjoying yourself? It turns out they are happier at the office than they are when they're spending time with their kids. Moment to moment, they actually enjoy being at the office more than when they're at home. And I think that tells us something interesting about human psychology, that actually those two things that we might think go together, which is that perhaps having kids and spending time with your kids both makes you feel like you have more meaning in your life, and it's going to be fun because you love your kids and you care about them and you are not at work, you're on your private time. Those actually come apart, right? We tend to, kids is positive in one dimension in a way, but it's not positive on the other dimension. I think the same is true for a question like, major life events. Frank rightly said, but one of the reasons why this life satisfaction scale can be helpful in some contexts is that it seems to track those kind of major life events in a way that we feel matches up to what our expectations might be. Now, on the other hand, it's striking that some other metrics don't match up with that. And perhaps that means those metrics aren't super useful for everything, but it also tells us something very interesting. So it turns out, by and large, that people have kind of psychological set points, that this varies between you and me on this call, between different listeners. But by and large, people tend to wake up in the morning and either they are pretty happy in that moment or they're pretty unhappy in that moment. And not a lot can change that over time. And if your psychological set point is that you tend to be a 7 out of 10, then a major life event like a parent dying, like getting a divorce, like losing your job, is going to throw you off that course for a little while. And it's going to throw off your life satisfaction measure in a much more permanent way, in a much bigger way. But 6 months down the line, 12 months down the line, your moment-to-moment enjoyment is probably roughly where it was 6 months ago. Even though you've experienced something terrible, perhaps you've had a leg amputated.
I was just going to say, yeah, even permanent disfigurements that sort of follow you through life, you fall back to your baseline once you've adapted. It's quite remarkable.
Right. And I've obviously never experienced anything like that, but I remember when I was in grad school and I broke my ankle, right? And I led a very active life. I was running around for work and meeting friends and all kinds of things. And suddenly for 2 or 3 months, I basically had to sit at home and sometimes, take a cab into the department to teach a class or something like that, which I could barely afford as a grad student. And I thought this would have a major impact on my moment-to-moment mood. And after a week or two, I kind of got used to it. I spent more time at home. I was lucky that some friends were able to come and visit me and so on. I read more. I led a slightly more quiet life for a few months. And I think moment to moment, I was about as happy as I was before. Perhaps my life satisfaction was a little bit lower. There's some things I couldn't do during those months that I would have liked to do. But moment to moment, humans have this amazing capacity to adjust. And I think that's interesting to note where those things come apart. Of course, you don't want to have a terrible car accident that's going to lead to the amputation of your leg. Of course, in some ways, that's really going to meaningfully impact your life satisfaction. But moment to moment, 6 months in, you're probably going to be back to where you were before. And that, I think, is a fascinating insight that we start to get when we look at how these different dimensions of happiness don't correlate, how they can come apart.
Yeah,
Frank, that's interesting, but at the same time, it's like good to remember that probably even in that situation, even if your positive feelings were back to the level, if you would have the choice that okay, now your ankle will be healed, you will be willing to pay quite much money to have it healed next day because that would increase your life satisfaction. And I think that sometimes people's choices are more predictive, based on their satisfaction rather than their positive feelings. Remember, there's some study, for example, about holidays, where they ask people expectations of the satisfaction during the holiday. Then after the holiday, they also ask how satisfied were you during the holiday. But then they also had this moment to moment measures during the holiday about how do you feel right now. And as you mentioned, there was quite much difference between these evaluations. So people's expectation before was more predictive of their life satisfaction afterward, or holiday satisfaction afterwards than their actually moment-to-moment feelings during the holiday. Because I guess you remember the best points about the holiday afterwards, but you remember or forget about kind of these moment-to-moment things. But at the same time, when people were then asked, do you want to go to a holiday at the same place next year? Then this satisfaction afterwards was the more predictive of that again. So in a way, that our moment-to-moment happiness or like feelings, they tend to be quite like, adaptive in the same that, our life can change, but that we still find these small moments of joyfulness or in quite many different situations. But at the same time, when we think about what choices we made in life and whether we want to like, change something in their life, I guess like then the life satisfaction can be like more predictable. This kind of willingness needs to change something in one's life.
Yeah, that must be then true in the corollary as well, in the reverse. Positive life effects also baseline within a certain period of time, which also says something interesting both about individuals, but maybe also about populations. I think that's a nice, interesting theme for a next question. I mean, one thing I was going to ask a bit earlier, but it's a good opportunity to ask it now is, so one criticism that I inferred from your text, Yascha, is that if you use the wrong term, happiness in this case, is there a bit of a risk for this sort of very subtle collective gaslighting through like this strange Chinese whispers where you use the word happiness here, and then when that gets repeated and repeated and repeated in a different context, maybe to the extent that, okay, now in parliament you're talking about measures in another country, like, okay, Finland's the happiest country, maybe we should also implement measures to make ourselves the happiest country. I mean, I'm not saying I would not recommend that, but I mean, the question is whether or not that is an accurate statement to make, and whatever, even if it's an accurate statement or not, it's very consequential at that moment. So the question is, do you think is there any point in trying to do happiness improving measures? Is there any point in having happiness as a end goal for politics or your personal life if it's this fleeting?
Yeah, I think, look, at some level, it's just a fun discussion. It's just interesting to debate about happiness, and it's interesting to engage with what this report tries to claim. I do think that there's two more serious worries I have about the potential damage it might do. The first is just one of trust in institutions. Published by the United Nations and the Oxford University, I believe it's called the Center for Happiness. It has the imprimatur of these very serious institutions, but it is engaged ultimately in what the technical term that the American philosopher Harry Frankfurt called bullshit, which is to say, it's sort of trying to pass this off as something, but it isn't quite, because that's how we get attention. There's kind of a little bit of a winking element to this. We know actually it's more complicated, but we're going to just take this one dimension called the World Happiness Report. And I just think that in a moment in which there's a lot of mistrust in institutions and growing mistrust in institutions, even in Scandinavia, and in which this is one of the things that helps populists thrive, we should really interrogate, serious institutions like the United Nations, like the University of Oxford, putting the name behind something that I do think plays on this, that sort of, gets attention by slightly misleading people, what it's really telling them in a way that to me is a little bit troubling. The second point is that, every index, every metric can quickly become a goal. So, I know a lot of people, perhaps some listeners to this podcast, believe in this idea of blue zones. It's a completely different example, but it's an instructive one, right? There's supposedly some researcher came up with this idea, these 5 or 6 regions in the world where people are particularly healthy and they live a particularly long time. Places like Sardinia off Italy, Okinawa in Japan, and so on. And so there's this whole cottage industry of nutrition books saying, how are people eating in these blue zones? And if you want to live a long time, how can you become like them? Well, it turns out that this is almost certainly just a statistical set of anomalies. When you look, for example, at the number of people who live, well beyond 100 years in those places, there's statistical anomalies which indicates that what's really special about those places is not that they're particularly healthy, they have a particularly good diet, is that they have particularly poor record keeping. And the share of people who continue to claim pensions for the deceased relatives is higher in Okinawa, which is really far away from Tokyo and has its own kind of culture within Japan, than it is in other parts of the country. And that's why Okinawa is supposedly this blue zone. So, there's this whole cottage industry of telling people you should eat like those people, you're going to live a long time. And it turns out what's really going on is that those places are less well governed than other parts of Japan and Italy, and therefore more people are able to commit fraud and so on, is really telling us a completely different thing. I do think there's some amount of danger that if we take metrics like this World Happiness Report too seriously, and if we try and make happiness the object of government policy, we're not going to be very good at doing that. And there's attempts to do that. Bhutan sells itself often as the happiest country, one of the happiest countries in the world, because the official goal of a government is to grow its national happiness index. There was a commission spearheaded by Nicolas Sarkozy, the former French president, at some point, to put happiness more at the center of what states aim for. And I'm just a little bit skeptical that we figured out how to measure happiness in a sufficiently sensible way, but we have an idea of what kind of policies would actually boost happiness in that kind of way. I think we can probably go to more traditional metrics, whether that's GDP, which is an economic metric but does correlate with a lot of positive outcomes, or whether that's something like a Human Development Index that the United Nations puts forward. It doesn't have to be a purely economistic one. But I think there is potentially a danger in making happiness the object of government policy.
Interesting 2 points there, Frank. Do you want to respond?
Yes. So I guess as regards this second point, I was when we think about what should be then the ultimate objective of government, I think in a way the well-being of the citizens living in that country will be one of the central things. I think even Adam Smith already said a couple of hundred years ago that that's kind of the happiness of the citizens is how the government should be judged, and they're kind of their sole purpose and use, in his words. So in a way, I guess that's something that we should aim for as governments, make sure that people have as high well-being as possible. And then the next question, of course, then what kind of measures we can use to get there, because what you measure tends to be what you get. And I guess then this GDP per capita and GDP more generally has been quite much been one of the kind of key metrics of the success or development of a nation. And I think that because GDP doesn't always of course it correlates with happiness, but the higher the level of GDP per capita, kind of the weaker the correlation is, in a way that that if we compare Finland or Nordic countries to sub-Saharan African countries, then GDP per capita can explain quite much of the differences in this people's life satisfaction. But then when we go to these within Europe comparisons, then the GDP per capita no longer is very good, very helpful in explaining why some nations have higher levels of life satisfaction than others. So in a way, I would think that life satisfaction is not a perfect measure of well-being of the people, but it's still it's more right than many economic indicators. So we should in a way at least complement the focus that we have on these economic indicators with also a focus on these life satisfaction indicators as well, and also kind of the research base from which to make then policy recommendations about what to do to increase people's life satisfaction. There's more and more research that has come out in the last 15 years or 20 years that is helping us to make good choices. That if that would be our goal, then there are things that we could do in order to increase people's sense of life satisfaction. So yeah, so in that sense, I kind of I wouldn't say that it should be the only thing that we're trying to optimize. I guess whatever one measure is always going to have its weak points and its blind spots, but at the same time, I think that it should be one of the key metrics that we follow when we think about the kind of what kind of policies we want to make. And actually, one thing that it's interesting that these life satisfaction measures also predict how people are voting in elections. Actually, because there's it's been quite well known for a long time that it is economic indicators can predict whether people are voting for the opposition party in the next election or not. So if the economic indicators are going in a good direction, then people are more prone to vote for the party which is in power. And if economic indicators are going down, then that tends to predict people voting more for the opposition parties. But then I guess in the last 5 or 10 years, there have been more and more studies showing that it's the same for these life satisfaction measures. So if we know the life satisfaction of a certain region, then we can predict how people in that region are going to be voting. For this, there was George Ward had this one study for about 2016 presidential elections in the US when Trump was first elected, and he was able to show that actually these subjective well-being measures, on a I think it was a county level that they had these county level measures of life satisfaction. Then they had this county level economic metrics, and these county level life satisfaction measures were the better predictors of whether people chose to vote for Trump rather than the other party. compared to these purely economic indicators. So it's kind of like it matters. Like if we want to like just from the point of view of wanting to know what people are going to be voting in the next elections, even in that case, it's quite good to know how their life satisfaction is going, in what direction is like developing.
And just, I'd like to hear your take on Yascha's first point as well, which was, in this time of sort of anti-establishment populism, do you think we should be more careful about giving fodder to those sort of sentiments? I mean, United Nations is coming out with this report, and it's all well and fun when a Finnish newspaper comes out with a, junior journalist writes a report about, short article about Finland, maybe does an Instagram reel that even I shared this year. And I shared a reel that the city of Helsinki made about the World Happiness Report because I thought the message was nice and the picture was nice and everything. So, but in some sense, maybe I was propagating bullshit, as Yascha is saying. And we kind of agree on that premise already, that the term happiness and life satisfaction are quite different. And before you respond, Frank, I just want to underline to all the listeners, you haven't been doing this. I found an interview even way before all of this where you said the international comparisons of national happiness typically focus on life satisfaction. They ask people, how satisfied are you with life? Finland seems to excel here, and on and on and on. So you've been very open about this. You seem very knowledgeable about this, but most people don't take the time or the energy to sort of make this separation. What do you think about Yascha's point there about institutional trust?
So I said, like, no, I still would think that this life satisfaction, life evaluation is one part of, like, when we think about this, like, overall concept of happiness, that it's like one part of that. So I wouldn't say that it's like, of course, like would be more accurate to call it like World Life Satisfaction Index or World like Life Evaluation Index. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that it's like bullshit to call it happiness. So in the same sense, I know we sometimes GDP per capita is quite a typical measure. Sometimes we call it like, the wealth of the nation. And again, like, I wouldn't say that, GDP per capita doesn't measure the wealth of the nation, but like quite often we make this association that, we use GDP per capita as a measure of kind of like how wealthy a certain nation is. So in that sense, like that would be like, again, something that it's a bit quite an inaccurate way of describing what the GDP is actually measuring. But as an overall, general public thing, it might work like, when we want to rank nations based on like, their wealth, quite often we rank them based on like their GDP per capita. So in the same sense, I would say that, this happiness, calling it happiness report, of course, like it's kind of like a marketing thing as well. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that it makes it like completely inaccurate or like, might make people trust it less, because like it still measures something that people seem to be finding quite important, which is like how satisfied they are with their lives.
Now, Yascha, I might be trampling on your reply here. Feel free to interject, but you specifically said technical term bullshit, right? Not bullshit broadly. Harry Frankfurt's term bullshit refers to, it's not a lie, it's not the truth, it's somewhere in between. It's a statement of which the point is not truth or lies. It's bullshit can be truthy. It can be aligned to the truth in some way. It can be reflective of some sort of truth, but it's still not accurate in the sense that we might expect from an institution like the United States. I expect this is the point that you were trying to make, Yascha.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a kind of, at the core of what Frankfurt means by bullshit is kind of an indifference to the truth. You get it in advertising a lot, right? When you say this product is 100% good, what on earth does it mean for this, yogurt to be 100% good? The advertiser is trying to communicate, this is really yummy. And the, reader of this advertisement understands, okay, they're telling me this is high quality, they're telling me it's going to be tasty, I should give it a try. They kind of understand that it's not really being communicated in some literal sense. They understand that there's no real meaning to it being 100% good. I think in choosing to call this the World Happiness Report, there's a little bit of bullshit in that sense. There's a kind of, well, look, it's not really happiness. I mean, it's arguably one subdimension, but we know that it's more complicated than that. The authors of the report are sophisticated people. When you read the whole report, there's all kinds of sophisticated things they're doing with positive affect, negative affect. But look, we want to get those newspaper headlines, and probably we're not going to get funding if 1 year the report doesn't get all those newspaper headlines. We kind of can't keep doing this anymore. So let's just call it the World Happiness Report. And we're a little bit indifferent about the fact that people are going to take the wrong conclusion from that. So that's why I would call it bullshit in that kind of Harry Frankfurt sense. I get where the temptation is coming from. I don't think the people who do this are bad people. I certainly don't think they're stupid people. I think they're smart, sophisticated researchers. I do worry for that our willingness to engage in that kind of bullshit ends up being quite corrosive of public trust. I think in some ways we had that in various points in the pandemic where people wanted to overstate the benefit of something in a way that ended up being quite corrosive. So let me give you the example of vaccines, which were a wonderful life-saving invention, one of the real success stories of the pandemic, where we ended up getting those vaccines far faster than people would have expected when COVID was first discovered. And that is the thing that both saved many lives and allowed us to go back to a semblance of normal life much faster than we might have been able to otherwise. But at first, there was this expectation that the vaccines wouldn't just protect people who took them against severe disease, which for the most part they do, but also that it would really stop the transmission of the disease. And so we oversold what the benefit would be. And even once it became obvious, public health authorities were very reluctant to admit to the fact that that was the case. That's when I think they started entering into the realm of bullshit. They started to say, well, look, the goal is a good one, which is to get people to take these vaccines, which really are going to improve their lives, which really are going to save their lives. So we're going to be indifferent to the fact that some of the claims we're making in pricing this vaccine actually aren't fully backed up by the evidence. And I think rather than increasing trust in public health and getting more people to take these life-saving vaccines, what it did was the opposite. It eroded trust in those institutions. So I just think, whether it's an institution like the United Nations, whether it's a national health service, we should be very, very, very careful about engaging in bullshit, even if it's not done for nefarious purposes. It doesn't feel all that bad. We're just dressing it up a little bit, making it a little bit sexier. I think we're not in a good place when institutions get in the habit of doing that.
And actually, another reason I think might be a good idea to call it more like some life satisfaction or life evaluation is that because I would want that the politicians would take this more seriously, these kind of rankings, and there's this happiness leads to it being bit of this feel good thing that the reporters come to Finland and then they go to the sauna and then they take a walk into nature and then they said, yeah, this is the secret to Finnish happiness, the sauna and stuff like that. But if it would be called life satisfaction index, and it might be then it might be something that the policymakers might be more interested because it sounds a more serious topic than just happiness, which is kind of this bit, not easily just this, that in the end of the news, there's going to be this fun part and that's going to be about happiness rather than the serious news about, hey, that the United Nations ranking has dropped from, I don't know how many, now I think it was 24th. I think 10 years ago, it was still 12th or something like that, which something that, that I think policymakers might take quite seriously, that what has happened, what has caused this kind of decline in people's life satisfaction during these years. So I would hope that it will be taken more seriously by the politicians, and then this life satisfaction or life evaluation might serve that goal also better.
Isn't that interesting?
That's a nice point, and perhaps... Sorry.
I just want to... you go ahead, Yascha, you're the guest.
Yeah, let me jump in briefly, Emil. That's a nice point. And, I started off a conversation with guardedly raining on Scandinavia's parade, saying that perhaps the countries aren't quite as happy as they appear. Perhaps I can end the conversation by celebrating Scandinavia a little bit, because in a sense, if this was just a story of, it just so happens that you stumbled upon the saunas and the nature and, the mentality to just enjoy your life all day long, that would be less of an accomplishment, right? In a sense, the life satisfaction report actually indicates more of an accomplishment, which is that you've built the political institutions and the economy and the social trust that does seem to give people greater life satisfaction in a meaningful way. And actually, for the title, life satisfaction report might be less sexy. As you're pointing out, Frank, it indicates that there's something more serious behind that. And so rather than saying, hey, you know what, this report is a little bit of a sham and that shows a way in which we're celebrating Scandinavia that is mistaken, which is still believed to be true, another way of framing that is, once you understand truly what the report is about, it also calls attention to something that Scandinavia really should be celebrated upon for, because it really is quite exceptional in those ways.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of this, as regards this ranking. One thing that strikes me from this report is quite a big gap between the countries on the top and the bottom. So if you think about the scale is from 0 to 10, and the Finland, the average is 7.7. which is quite a high average, given that it's like not just the average of the people. Then if you like go to the bottom of the ranking, you will find like Afghanistan, which is like where like average life evaluation is 1.3, which is like very low. So like if you think about, like 0 is the worst possible life and the average is 1.3, it means that, quite big portion of the population actually thinks that their life is like very close to the worst possible life that one could live, which is like, quite a horrible thing to know. And also like, in that sense, like the ranking, that the kind of like the variety of like averages that the countries has is quite big, like from like Afghanistan at the bottom, and then then you find like some other country, Iraq, like 4.9 in the ranking, and then like when you go up like that, then you start to find this more like, European countries and Nordic countries in the top. But what I tend to say about like this, like that this report or like, these rankings is that in a way, like governments cannot make citizens happy, but they can remove quite many sources of unhappiness. And that's kind of like why the Scandinavian or like Finnish ranking is so, or the average is so high. It's not because there will be like, so many people who like say that my life is like 10 out of 10, but it's actually because there's like so little people who say that their life is like anything below the midpoint. So a couple of years ago, I looked at the data and it was like, I think 3% of the Finnish people who said that their life is anything below the midpoint. So 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Everybody else, like 97% of the population on this scale from 0 to 10, their life were like at least on the like mid-level or higher. So, and that's kind of like driving up the kind of like averages in the Nordic countries, that there's very little people who are very dissatisfied with their lives.
Yeah. Very interesting. And also, that was a very, very interesting point, the one you made there about, maybe we should call it life satisfaction report. In some sense, maybe one reason why people take it as this flippant, sort of quite trivial, feel-good result every year, even here, is the fact that maybe we know that it's a bit bullshit to use the word happiness there. Because happiness is, if you then, think about the word in itself, it's one of the most profound things in life. It's not feel good or trivial or flippant. It's some of the greatest works of philosophy have been written about happiness, what that is, and that being maybe the main goal of life. But yeah, maybe that is why even some people, you and me recognize this, Frank, every year. It's almost a meme these days when the results are published, and 8th year in a row, Finland's the biggest, and then everyone needs to make that mandatory joke that they're surprised, and I can't believe this is, there's no way this is true. There's no way this is true. And there's some truth to that meme. There's some truth to that joke, I must say, I suspect.
Yeah, I think like especially the first year when Finland was like announced the happiest country, and the Finnish people like generally were reacting with quite much skepticism. They were thinking that there must be something wrong with the report, because like Finnish people self-image is quite far from being like very happy people.
Yeah,
we are more the self-image is more about like us being like a bit melancholic and introverted kind of people.
Yeah, and I feel like we've actually made, dare I say, intellectual progress over the course of this conversation, which is to say that, because of how the report is labeled, certainly in the foreign press, right, there's this desperate attempt to say, why are Finnish people so happy? And versus ours, and it's because of the saunas and because of the nature and because of whatever. It's a beautiful country. It is a beautiful country, but all of that just sounds like bullshit, right? That doesn't seem to be what makes Finland distinctive. There's lots of other countries that have fun cultural customs, that have beautiful nature, that have better weather, right? That just doesn't seem to be what Finland is distinctive on. Yeah. If Frank says, look, when he wants to dig into the data, one of the things that's really striking about Finland is not even, it's not that people are sort of incredibly deliriously happy moment to moment. It's not even that, the number of people who are the most satisfied is particularly striking. But Finland is really, really good, and other Scandinavian countries are really, really good at making sure that most people have a reasonable level of life satisfaction. A good number of people have high levels, but very, very, very few people have very low levels. And, that I think is a much more profound and interesting thing to say about Finland and other Scandinavian societies. And to me, at least, it tracks much more with my mental model of what those countries are like, right? There's very concrete institutions that help to make sure that even, for example, if you're not at the top of society, even if you haven't made the most money of anybody in your high school class, even if you're, not uncommonly successful, you get to lead a meaningful, humane, self-determined life. in dignified conditions, that seems to me both a more interesting claim and one that says a lot more about the country and has a much firmer empirical foundation.
Yeah, and I agree. I agree with that, and I think in that sense, like calling it something different might be helpful in that goal. And also, it might that also if you want to make it a political goal, that kind of saying that that goals of politics should be to make people happy. That sounds not so good as saying that the goal of politics should make sure that as many citizens as possible are not in a miserable position in life. So making sure that we are able to lift everybody up at least to a certain level.
Yeah, definitely. And it would be weird if it was saunas and all these other culture things we have here, because there's this weird thing where every single cultural artifact that tourists try here in Finland, whether it's an ice bath, salty licorice, or a hot sauna, it's kind of inbuilt to the experience that you're not supposed to enjoy it as much as Finns enjoy it. We're in fact a little bit surprised when tourists actually enjoy it, a little bit disappointed even. So no, it's definitely not those things. But thank you. Very well put there, Yascha. We've made intellectual progress in this conversation. I do feel like that is the case. I am very thankful that both of you came on the show. Thank you so much, Yascha Mounk and Frank Martela. I hope you also had a great time.
Thank you.
Yes,
that was fun.
Yeah, it was fun. And I think, also that we made some intellectual progress. So thanks for the conversation.
Thank you so much. All right. That's it, listeners and viewers. Please subscribe. We're going to have more English language episodes in the future. We already have some in our catalog. We have a playlist on our channel if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're not watching this on YouTube, go to YouTube. We have a playlist there. Okay. Please subscribe. Please like. Please leave a comment if this episode raised any thoughts or questions. All right. See you later.